Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And good evening and good morning to our audience from Asia. My name is Jianan Yang, and I'm the postdoc fellow here at the Asia House Policy Program at the Sharonstan Asia Pacific Research Center. Welcome to today's PKU Stanford Joint Webinar on Asia House Policies. And today we are very delighted to have Professor Manisha Shah from UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs as our esteemed speaker, who will enlighten us on critical topic of intimate partner violence. And here I would also like to acknowledge our co-host, the Peking University Institute of Global Health and Development. And it is therefore my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Yuhan Pan from Peking University today, and who will be moderating today's discussion. And I hope this evening will be both informative and engaging for all of us. Without further ado, let me turn the virtual space to my colleague Yu Hang for the remarks and an introduction of our speaker.
Okay, thanks, Janan, and thanks everyone for joining us. Please let me introduce our today's speaker. As an economist, Professor Shah received her PhD from UC Berkeley, and she's currently is the Franklin Gilliam Jr. Endowed Chair in Social Justice and Professor of Public Policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. And she's also the founding director of the Global Lab for Research in Action. Manisha also holds affiliations at various important academic institutes, such as NBER, UC Berkeley Center for Effective Global Action, and etc. Her research interests primarily lie at the intersection of applied micro, health, and development. She has written several papers on the economics of sex markets in order to learn how more effective policies and programs can be deployed to slow the spread of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Manisha has been a PI on various impact evaluations, and she has RCTs and is currently leading the projects in various countries such as Tanzania, Indonesia, and India. Her research has been supported by various grants such as from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank, and the National Science Foundation, among others. She's currently the editor at the Journal of Health Economics and an associate editor at the Review of Economics and Statistics. So without further ado, let's welcome Manisha.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really great to be here today. I'm excited to share some of this new work with all of you. And before I get started, I just want to mention that this is joint work with Jennifer Seeger, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Global Health at George Washington University, João Montalvão at the World Bank, and Marcus Goldstein, who is now at Amazon. So today I want to spend the hour that we have together talking about a global public health epidemic. And, you know, these days when you hear global public health epidemic, you think COVID, but it's not COVID. In fact, it's intimate partner violence. What you're seeing right now, this is a heat map that we generated, which shows the prevalence of IPV by region across the globe. And you can see that prevalence ranges anywhere from kind of a low of 16% to a high of 66%. I will say, you know, these are pre-COVID numbers. We know in a lot of places, in fact, I've been doing a lot of work in India on this topic, that these numbers have actually increased a lot in certain parts of the world due to COVID-related lockdowns and people kind of being stuck together in households. But globally, the kind of average number that you often hear is that 1 in 3 women will experience IPV or intimate partner violence. Now, this is also a big policy problem for adolescents across the globe, and adolescents in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we'll be working, are no different. There's been kind of a big proliferation of I would say applied micro papers recently looking at the negative impacts of IPV on things like, you know, physical health, mental health, female labor force participation, household consumption, the health of children in households. But I also want to say there's kind of a large public health literature, right, also showing that we worry about IPV also because it's associated with a lot of other risky behaviors, right, whether this be unintended teenage pregnancies, multiple partnerships, low contraceptive use, et cetera, et cetera. And the kind of, last thing I want to say about this is the other kind of compounding problem here, and I think this is true across the globe, is that power dynamics between males and females, social norms in most places, and I would say, generally speaking, a lack of bargaining power of kind of females relative to men really limits females' abilities to make safer sexual choices for themselves. So if we look at the literature, there's both, for those of you who know me, I sort of work often at the intersection of economics and public health. But if we kind of focus really on the causal literature on, hey, what do we know about like what decreases IPV amongst adolescents, anywhere in the world? And I would actually say there's very little evidence on this issue. There's a nice recent paper by Victoria Baranov and co-authors showing that most of the causal evidence that we have on decreasing violence for adults generally relates to either cash transfers or income. Okay, so kind of cash and income we know are at least causally linked to decreasing IPV amongst adults. If we zoom out a bit further and we say, hey, if we're just kind of interested in sexual and reproductive health outcomes amongst adolescents, like what do we know there? I would say a lot of the literature has suggested that the kind of effective interventions have been much more demand side related, meaning, education, educational subsidies, cash, both kind of conditional as well as unconditional cash transfers. The other 2 points I want to make about this literature is, one, there's been, generally speaking, a kind of utter lack of involvement of boys and men in much of the traditional sexual and reproductive health programming that we see across the globe. And then the other point I want to make is when we've sort of involved men, the focus has generally been on married couples, right, and or adults. And so again, adolescents have just not been that involved in SRH programming, in family planning programming across the globe. Now, while the experiment I'm going to talk to you about today, we do it in Tanzania, but I just want to say that I think many of the lessons we learn, and in fact, kind of a lot of what I'm going to say today is also very relevant to the Asian context. And in fact, a lot of my research is also in kind of India, Indonesia, et cetera. So I just wanted to make that point given probably the audience today. All right, so what are we going to do? We basically are going to run a large randomized controlled trial with the ultimate goal to change some of these power dynamics, right? To shift some of these power dynamics in these adolescent relationships and improve outcomes related to intimate partner violence, as well as other kind of risky sexual and reproductive health outcomes. And so I think it's actually easier if I just show you the design this way. And so we are, I'll tell you a little more about all of the interventions in a minute, but we're basically going to be working with BRAC. So BRAC these days is the world's largest NGO. In fact, a lot of this work that we're going to be looking at started in Bangladesh, but they've brought ELA clubs to Uganda, Tanzania, Sudan, Sierra Leone. And so we're going to be working with BRAC in Tanzania in their ELA clubs. And I will tell you what ELA clubs are in a minute, but this will form our sample frame. So we'll be working across about 150 rural communities. Each rural community has an ELA club. And what we're going to do is we're going to layer on additional interventions to these ELA clubs. And you can think about ELA again as kind of, what it is it's basically life skills, educating young women. And what we're going to do is we're going to layer on some additional interventions. So in 50 of our clubs will just stay business as usual. We'll do nothing. These will be our control communities or our control clubs. We'll then, layer on a supply side arm where we were basically bringing modern contraceptives to our adolescent girls. I'm not going to say much about this arm today, which is why it's grayed out here. And part of why I'm not going to say much about it today is this arm was basically, very ineffective. So we thought that bringing these girls, giving these girls access to kind of free modern contraceptives would increase take-up. In fact, it doesn't. And so we're actually writing a separate paper on why this arm was basically a flop. And then the sort of third arm that we'll layer on is in 50 of our communities. At baseline, we ask these girls to tell us who their boyfriends are. And in 50 of these communities, we will invite the boyfriends to participate in a soccer intervention where we also kind of teach boys life skills. So I'll tell you about all of these interventions in a minute. So this will be the club level randomization, 50, 50, 50. And then on top of that, what we do is we layer on an individual level randomization where from each arm, we invited our girls to participate in a goal setting activity. And that goal setting activity will be around improving their sort of sexual and reproductive health behaviors. And again, I'll tell you about that in a minute. And so, today, basically what I'm going to be talking about in this paper is showing you the impacts of what happens when we invite boyfriends to also participate in some of these activities. And I guess I can just, so the one research question will be, does including males improve our female IPV outcomes? And we will find yes, when we go back 2 years later, the girls in these communities where we were working with the boys as well are going to report decreased experience of IPV. And then the other research question that I want to talk about today is, does inviting these girls to participate in this goal setting activity improve female IPV outcomes? And again, we will find, yes, it does. And then what I want to do is I want to spend some time, we've actually developed a game theoretical model to think through, kind of to understand some of the mechanisms behind like why we're observing these reductions in IPV in these communities. That's where we're going. For those of you who are curious about where we were working, as I mentioned, we're working with BRAC. They already work in Dodoma, Iringa, and Beya, and we're just going to kind of work in the communities they're already working with adolescent girls. And you can sort of think about these clubs as kind of an average of like 20 to 21 members. This is just a picture that was taken in one of the clubs. These are, the idea behind these clubs is they're these after school safe spaces for girls ages 11 to 22 to come and spend the afternoon. As I mentioned, these clubs started in Bangladesh, but now, BRAC is implementing them in Uganda, Tanzania, Sudan, Sierra Leone, but the World Bank, all sorts of international organizations now, these clubs are being kind of implemented globally right now. And the way you can think about these clubs is they basically are targeting a lot of life skills, right? And so they teach girls about adolescence and reproductive health and menstruation and pregnancy, how to avoid getting HIV, what a healthy relationship with a boy looks like, how do you build confidence? The ultimate goal, right? ELA stands for empowerment and livelihood for adolescents. And so I would say kind of the ultimate goal of these clubs is to kind of empower these girls to make better choices for themselves so that they have kind of improved longer term outcomes. Okay. So that's kind of the big piece of what these clubs do. For the older, the kind of 18 to 22-year-olds, there's also a little bit of income generating opportunities, etc. And so Oriana Bandiera and a bunch of her co-authors have done impact evaluations on ELA in Uganda. They've done some work in Sierra Leone and have found positive impacts of ELA. Part of why this collaboration started with me was, they had done a similar RCT in Tanzania, but were not finding any of the positive impacts in Tanzania from ELA. And so BRAC was interested in like, hey, are there additional interventions that we can layer on so that we can see what's going on and kind of improve the programming? And so part of how we chose our interventions that we layer on, BRAC basically told us, hey, we're not in the business of doing like cash transfers, for example, right? And so they really wanted kind of low cost, scalable, easy to implement interventions that they could kind of continue doing after we left, if we kind of found that these interventions had positive impact. That's kind of ELA, that's what BRAC does, right? And then enter the study. And so, as I mentioned, in 50 of these randomly selected communities, we collaborated with grassroots soccer. Now, grassroots soccer, what's interesting about them is their programming is very similar to what BRAC does with, ELA and adolescent girls, but grassroots soccer does this with their boys. And so they call it kind of life skills training for males ages 10 to 19, where they get together with boys once a week on the soccer field and they play soccer. But while they're playing soccer, they're also, learning about risk behavior and risky partners and using contraceptives and, how do you prevent getting infected with HIV? There's a few sessions also on intimate partner violence and, respecting girls and women and kind of, not mixing alcohol and sex. And so, we're going to have about 1,000 boys that go through the grassroots soccer curriculum in our 50 communities. And, this is just to give you an example of like what one of their session looks like. So that, this is one day they show up at the soccer field. The coaches have set up these kind of orange cones. Each cone here is a risk behavior, right? This is unprotected sex. This is multiple partners. This is older partners, this is sex and alcohol. And the exercise here, right, is you have to kind of kick the soccer ball around each cone and not touch the cone because the cone is a risk behavior, okay? And so a lot of it's a really interesting curriculum. They mix like soccer and kind of teaching these boys about risk behaviors. They have key messages every lesson. They have like, these are just some examples, right? Like in life, we should all stand up for girls and women to protect them from abuse. And so, their whole philosophy is kind of based on this idea that kind of gender is not this zero-sum game, right? It's much more this like, hey, if we kind of learn to respect girls and women, we'll all be better off. They have things like red card behaviors, right? So an example of a red card behavior would be like if you see a girl who's being harassed by a bus driver because she doesn't have money for like bus fare and he's kind of harassing her and maybe asking her to have sex with him. This is a red card behavior where it's kind of the boys in the community should get together and stand up for the girl and, and tell the bus driver that his behavior is not acceptable, for example. Okay, so this is kind of the grassroots soccer curriculum. And this, as I mentioned, we implemented this in 50 of our communities with either boyfriends or friends of the girls who we were kind of already working with. The goal setting, as I mentioned, we kind of each arm, we layered on this individual goal setting activity. So we were very interested in goal setting because if you look at sort of the literature on goal setting, people talk about it being used in places where people, you may have problems with like self-regulation, problems with self-control, present bias. And in fact, recently there's been a lot of applications of goal setting in kind of low income, say like the South Side of Chicago, right? With low income teenagers around education. And kind of finding really, positive impacts of these kids setting goals and then improving test scores or improving grades. And so we were curious, I will say like the goal setting activity we did, I'll explain it to you in a minute, but it's very kind of straightforward from like what has already been done in the literature. I think the novel piece of what we did though, is there have been really no applications of goal setting to kind of sexual and reproductive health. And so, when we invited the girls to the activity, we gave them the goal, which was to stay healthy and remain STI and HIV negative for kind of, the year of this evaluation. And if the girl said, yeah, I'm interested in setting this goal, then we basically went through this Duran 1981 SMART process, which is actually a process that's very widely used in cognitive behavioral therapy these days. And so the way this works is, you're doing this exercise one-on-one. It's 60 to 90 minutes with, a trained enumerator type of person. And so what our girls, what we basically asked them to do was to come up with 0 to 3 strategies that they would have to implement, right? That would involve kind of behavioral change on their part to be able to achieve this goal of staying healthy and remaining STI and HIV negative. And so that was, the kind of first piece of the intervention was this, like, setting these strategies. And then we came back 4 months later just to check in and be like, hey, how's it going? You had set your strategies. Are you meeting them? Like, what behavioral problems are you running into? What are you doing when you run into behavioral problems? And that was probably like a kind of 15 to 20 minute check-in. Okay, so that's goal setting. And just, some people are often curious about, like, what kind of strategies these girls were setting. I mean, the number one strategy was to use a condom. But remember, we're working with girls ages 11 to 22. I would say, for most of these girls, sex kind of turns on at around 16, 17. And so for many of our girls who are not sexually active yet, right, they're, a big strategy. And for many of these girls, it was the girls who weren't sexually active yet, was like, hey, I'm going to keep being not sexually active, right? I'm going to abstain from sex. And so you kind of, you had both the, like, I'm going to use condoms or have safer sex versus I'm just going to kind of delay entry into sex is a strategy as well. Timeline is a 2-year project. We did a census and baseline of, like, all of the girls in our clubs. Then all the we started the boys soccer, we did the goal setting, the contraceptives, everything. And then we show up 2 years later, we do another census and we collected the end-line survey. And so all of the results that I'll show you today will be from the baseline and end-line survey. This is just to give you an idea of these, we had pre-registered outcomes related to IPV, as well as, I should mention that we actually did test all of the girls at baseline for HIV and STIs, but kind of, in fact, very good news for the girls. Prevalence ended up being much lower than we had anticipated it would be. So we're underpowered, and I won't show you any of the, there's no kind of STI results because prevalence was really low. But this first column here, so this is all of our girls at baseline to give you a sense of, like, experience of any IPV in the last year. And then the second column is the girls who are already sexually active at baseline. And what you'll see here is this kind of 1 in 3 number, that we often hear about the global prevalence of IPV. It's our girls, 27% of our girls who were sexually active at baseline are experiencing, some IPV in the last year. In the data that we collected, we basically followed, for those of you who are interested, we followed the demographic and, the DHS surveys in terms of asking, we have sort of psychological abuse, physical abuse, as well as sexual abuse, and we have it all separately. In the results I'll show you today, where we basically just generate indices of, any IPV, and that's what I'll show you. But in the, if any of you are interested in seeing the paper, we also do things kind of separately by type of violence as well. And you'll see that kind of psychological abuse is the most common, with physical abuse coming in second, and kind of sexual, rape and forced sex coming in at third. This is an RCT, so I would be, I will just tell you, we have many balance tables in the paper, and we're very well balanced across the various arms. And so, I'm not going to say much today about balance. I'm also not going to probably have that much time to say much about attrition, but we spend time in the paper talking about both balance and attrition, and we do okay there. What we want to do is we're going to estimate ITT, intent to treat, estimates of kind of everything together. And so let me say one thing, which is, today, the results I will show you will be from our balanced panel of girls, right? Remember, we went in at baseline, we come back 2 years later, and there's new girls in the clubs when we come back 2 years later, but all of the results I will show you today will be from our balanced panel of girls. And the reason for this is because in order to get sort of the causal estimates for, like beta 2, for example, which was the invitation to goal setting, we selected girls to participate, we selected girls to invite to participate in the goal setting because they showed up in our baseline sample. We basically randomly sampled girls for goal setting from our baseline sample. And so all of that to basically say, I'm going to show you results for our balance panel today. Okay. So that's one thing. What else do I want to say? The other thing I want to say is, I will show you, given we sort of test for impacts for impacts on multiple outcomes in kind of the same category, right? We're going to be interested in violence. We have many different measures of violence. And so what I'm going to do today, again, I'll show you, we just construct a summary index, which we'll be able to interpret in kind of standard deviations. We're just going to conduct a single test, right, to address the issue of multiple inference. And we'll follow the Kling-Liebman-Katz way of doing that. What else do I want to say? We're going to do DDs. And so basically, I'm going to show you results for beta 1, where beta 1 will just be the kind of, for our girls, it'll just be the ITT effect of, whatever the outcome, whether it's violence or whatever, of you being in a community, right, where boys in that community were being treated. Beta 2 will be the ITT effect of being invited to participate in the goal setting activity. I want to say, because of our design, we have this kind of cross cut where there will be some girls who were both invited to goal setting, who are also in these communities where we were treating boys. And we were kind of interested in, are there kind of complementarities, right? Do you see additional, say, reductions in violence because the girls got both goal setting and boyfriends were being treated? We're not going to find these interesting complementarities and we can hopefully talk a little about why we don't find them here. Okay. I think that's all I want to say. And I will also mention, we include controls. You don't have, in some sense, it doesn't matter. And that's good news because this is an RCT. And then the other thing that we do, I showed you, we had that supply side arm. So we're going to control for the supply side arm in all of the regressions. But again, I'm not going to show you any of that.
Just to quickly clarify on the design, probably I missed it. So you basically have a 2x2 design, right? On the girl side, the intervention is goal setting, and on the boy side is soccer treatment.
Exactly.
And you have a style where like both the girl and the boy got the treatment.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, thanks.
Exactly. This is our IPV index, and this is just to, this basically, what this is saying is girls who were in these communities where boys were invited, to participate in our soccer intervention. When we come back at endline, these girls are reporting about a 0.19 standard deviation decrease in experiencing IPV. So this is kind of the beta 1 for the entire sample of girls. This is the effect of being in these communities where we were treating boys. That's kind of main result number 1. Main result number 2, now this is our beta 2 of, this is the, the ITT effect of being invited to participate in goal setting. And here now those girls are reporting about a 0.25 standard deviation decrease in experiencing IPV. Okay, so those are the kind of, this is for the whole sample. In the paper, we do a lot of heterogeneity as well, because like if you remember that table that I showed you that we were just talking about, right? The girls who are already sexually active at baseline are, for obvious reasons, they're actually experiencing a lot more IPV, right, than the girls who are not sexually active at baseline. And so we do some heterogeneity by sexual activity at baseline. We also do heterogeneity by age. In some sense, it all looks the same, but the kind of main point I want to make here is that the impacts are much larger, right? When we estimate these things, for example, this is just to show you. So these are girls who were already sexually active at baseline, who are in these communities where we're treating boys. For these girls, the reduction in IPV is about 0.38 standard deviation. Okay, so you'll see it's a much bigger decrease. And similarly, for girls who were invited to participate in the goal setting activity, and who were also already sexually active at baseline, again, they're reporting about a 0.4 standard deviation decrease in experiencing IPV. So the results are just kind of much bigger and much stronger for this group of girls who were already sexually active. Or similarly, you could look at this around by age kind of 16, 17, and you see really similar results. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, for most of these girls, sexual activity is kind of turning on around 16 or 17. What I want to do next is I want us to think about what is going on here, right? Like what is the, the kind of main results of, hey, in these communities where we're working with boys as well, we're seeing our girls report decreases in IPV. And when we invite these girls to kind of participate in the sexual and reproductive health goal setting activity, here also we see IPV decrease. And in some sense, like maybe it's not that surprising, the number one, the kind of, given what we were doing with the boys, maybe it's not that surprising that girls in those communities are decreased, are reporting decreased IPV when we come back. For us, I think the slightly more surprising result was that this goal setting activity, which in a way had nothing to do with IPV, right? It was really around kind of setting goals for improving your sexual and reproductive health behaviors, that also kind of resulted in this causal decrease in IPV. And so what I want to do now, I guess in the next like 20 or 25 minutes, is I want to think about like what kind of conceptual framework might help explain both of these results and help us like think through the mechanisms. We're basically now, there are a few models in the economic literature on IPV, but I would say many of these models are about households, and they're about control either over like household resources, or they're about control over children. Our model is going to look different. And part of why our model is going to look different is because we're not really in the world of like households and shared resources, because we're working with adolescents. Most of these adolescents don't have children, right? And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to borrow a lot from the public health literature here, where, I kind of mentioned this on the first slide, but there's really, a big public health literature showing correlations between like men using violence against women when they disagree over sexual relations. Okay. And in fact, for those of you who know me, I also have done a lot of work on sex markets. The same is true in sex markets. You see, violence in relationships when there's disagreement about kind of the type of sex that they're going to have in terms of like risky sex. And so the way we're going to think about this model is there will be, we're going to write some game theory. There's going to be two players, a male and a female. And here nature is really going to generate the male-female pair, okay? Each player, the male as well as the female, will either derive positive or negative utility from risky sex, right? Because the trade-off here, right, thinking about risky sex, and maybe a good example of risky sex is non-condom sex, right? And so the trade-off here is that like there's increased pleasure from engaging in non-condom sex, but there's also the cost is the potential health cost, right? I might get an STI, I might get infected with HIV, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the world where this male-female pairing happens, and say they both want risky sex, great, well, they'll have risky sex, right? And similarly, in the world where this pairing happens and they both want safe sex, right? They both want to use a condom, for example, they will have safe sex then. The game kind of becomes more salient or more interesting. Kind of violence enters into this game in the world where one player wants risky sex and the other player does not want it, okay? Now, I am going to present this model in a very heteronormative way, or it's going to be the male who wants the risky sex and the female who doesn't. it doesn't matter, right? We could play it the other way. This game could be between two males. It just, in our data, right? And in kind of the Tanzanian context, this is kind of where we see the violence happening. Okay. So we're in this world now where he wants risky sex. And she doesn't want it. And so we're focusing on that scenario, right, where males gain positive utility from risky sex. And that's going to be denoted by this SM term, where M is for male, and females gain negative utility from risky sex. And that will be given by this, SF being negative. And so formally, I guess the kind of the payoff from risky sex will be this SM and negative SF. Okay. What else do I want to say about this? Oh, in the world where he doesn't propose risky sex, right? We just normalize that payoff to 0, 0. And so all of our other payoffs, you can think about them as sort of additional benefits or additional costs associated with engaging in risky sex. And so this is kind of the game as it follows. And I want to say one thing, which is like, I'm showing you kind of the complete information version of this game to give you an idea of what the game looks like. But when we solve it, right, when we do all the kind of the algebra to solve this game, each player, right, so the male will know his own payoffs. He's not going to know the female's payoffs. And similarly, she knows her payoffs, but she doesn't know his payoffs. And so, basically the male proposes risky sex up here. This is, so we are in the world where he proposes. She has to decide, the female has to decide, like, yes, I'll say yes to risky sex, or no, I don't want to engage in risky sex. Now, if she says no, then he has to decide whether or not he is going to accept her no, right? In which case, if he accepts her no, they're back to the 0, 0 payoff. Or, maybe he will threaten violence because he really wants that risky sex and he's not going to, kind of accept her no. And so in the world where he threatens violence on her, she then has to decide, do I stay in this relationship and endure the violence, right? Or do I basically just exit this relationship because I don't want to kind of endure the violence, okay? I mean, even in the world where she exits, there's sort of this threat of violence, but what we're really worried about, these are the girls we worry about, right? These are the girls who kind of stay in these relationships and endure this like chronic violence. In terms of like, how are we doing on them? I don't have much time, so I don't want to spend too much time now, going through the math, but let me just quickly say, like, in this game there will be two types of females, right? And this is going to be important. There's going to be the types of females who can exit, right? And they can exit because basically going back here, they both have some costs associated with exit. And then for her, this is the cost associated with violence. And for him, it's, not a cost, it's actually a benefit. And so, we're going to call the girls who exit are high type girls. And we're going to call the girls who can't exit, right, who sort of stay in these relationships and endure the violence, as our low type girls. What he knows the fraction of high types and low types in the population, but what he doesn't know is if the girl that he's paired with is a high type or a low type, right? But what he's going to be worried about is that she exits the relationship if he threatens violence. And what she's going to be worried about, let me just kind of, what she's going to be worried about, maybe it's easier here, is if, he's going to threaten violence or not. Now, again, she doesn't know if he's the type to threaten violence or not, but what she'll know is she'll know kind of the probability that that's going to happen. And so what we can do then, basically, we can solve for our P star, which is the probability that he inflicts violence conditional on her saying no to him. And we can solve for, so we're going to basically solve for an equilibrium Q and P star, where the Q star, right, will be the probability that she exits, kind of conditional on him threatening violence. And the reason we solve for this Q star and this P star is then we can take these probabilities, right, back to our interventions, and we can think about how these interventions may be shifting these probabilities, okay? And in fact, in these payoffs as well. And so if we think back to our soccer curriculum for the boys, what is the soccer curriculum doing? Well, One, it's aiming to reshape his attitudes towards IPV, right? Because it's teaching males the importance of, avoiding risk behaviors and stopping the spread of HIV, STIs, etc. So this actually has two potential ways of reducing violence. One is this could just decrease the benefit of SM, right? So maybe before you wanted to have risky sex with girls, now you've gone through the grassroots soccer curriculum and you kind of, you just get a lot less utility from risky sex. And so, we had started this saying for males, SM is positive, they're going to propose risky sex. Now, maybe we just have fewer males who are proposing risky sex in the first place because they've learned, right, about the potential costs of engaging in risky sex. So that's one way we could, so we just have fewer males playing this game, hence this kind of decrease in violence. The other way the soccer curriculum could decrease violence is that it could also shift VM, right? Where, remember, VM was the kind of payoff he gets from inflicting violence. In that world, once we sort of decrease VM, what that means is now there will just be fewer males willing to inflict violence to get risky sex. Whether we're in this world of SM, kind of decreasing SM versus decreasing VM, both of these channels, though, would imply a reduction in violence. And so we take these predictions to our data. So one thing I didn't mention is, when we were collecting baseline and end-line data on all of our females, we also collected a smaller sample, but we collected baseline and end-line data on our males, our boyfriends as well. And so we collect things like violence attitudes from our males. And, this is, again, this is an index that we generate based on a bunch of different questions. But what you're seeing here is that for boys who were assigned to the, boys treatment arm, you do see an improvement in their attitudes around violence when we come back at end line. And so, we sort of, this is a proxy, right, for that VM, like how much benefit, right, do you get from violence? And we see that male violence attitudes do improve. We also look at, remember, this is the SM, right? Like we look at kind of their risk perceptions. Are their risk perceptions around risky sex changing? We ask them questions like, do you think your girlfriend has a right to, ask you to use a condom, right? And again, in the boys treatment arm, when we come back, boys in this arm are significantly more likely to kind of say like, yes, my girlfriend can ask me to put on a condom. Or, we also kind of ask them about what they thought the prevalence of, STIs were in their community, et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, all of this to say, it also looks like there's kind of that we're also shifting SM for these boys, right? And that, that they're much more attuned to kind of risk and, risky sexual behavior when we come back at end line. All right, so that's kind of that's the grassroots soccer arm. I want to say a few things now about goal setting. Like the goal setting is pretty interesting in that, remember, there's sort of nothing directly in goal setting about violence, but what goal setting is doing, right, is it's strengthening girls' commitment to adopt safe sexual behaviors to remain healthy. And so thinking back to like our payoffs in the model, what goal setting might be doing is increasing the cost of risky sex for her, right? It's increasing this S of F term across like the whole distribution of females. And remember, right, so what this means, right, is now the cost of risky sex for females has gone up. You're going to have more girls saying no to risky sex. The thing you worry about here, though, is you're going to have more girls saying no to risky sex. And here, the kind of theoretical prediction in terms of violence is ambiguous, right? And it's ambiguous because it's going to depend, the change in violence is going to depend on the types of girls saying no, right? So if you're the type of girl who is more likely to say no, and you're a high type, that's okay, because you'll exit the relationship, right? And we'll see a decrease in violence. But if the increase in no's is coming from the low types, right? So they're saying no more often, and they're still staying in the relationships because they're low types, then we'd observe an increase in violence here. I've already shown you that we observe a decrease in IPV due to goal setting. And so in our model, a necessary condition, right, for violence to decrease is that we need to see an increase in exits, right? We need to see an increase in sort of Q in these breakups, okay? And so that's basically what I'm going to show you now is, so column 2 here, this is our goal setting arm, the results here. And this is the whole sample of girls, right? Which is basically saying that it looks like girls in the goal setting treatment arm are significantly less likely to be with like the same partner they were with at baseline. You will also see, right, that they have a higher number of total sex partners over the last 2 years. And so it does look like there's kind of more churn going on in this arm. But then what we do, I mean, one thing you may be thinking is like, for the model, the kind of important piece of this is like, were you experiencing IPV, right? And so we kind of break this partner churn issue into, we look at girls who were experiencing IPV already at baseline, and then, versus they weren't experiencing IPV at baseline. And what you'll see here is that all of the churn, the kind of breaking up, is actually happening in this arm amongst the girls who were experiencing IPV at baseline. Okay, so it looks like these are the girls who are kind of like leaving or exiting these relationships. What else do I want to say about this? So the panel C is unrelated to our model. Like there's nothing in our model that kind of talks about what these, the boys they should look like, the new boys that they pair with, what they should look like. But one thing that we thought was interesting is, we asked them to give us characteristics of their boyfriends. And what's interesting about the girls in the goal setting arm is when we come back at end line, we call this partner quality, that the kind of new boys that they've paired with seem to be higher quality boys, in that, we look at kind of the age difference between the male and female, that's gone down. We look at whether he's in school, right? He's a lot less likely to be a dropout in school. And so when, they kind of, it looks like between baseline and end line, the girls in our goal setting arm are in fact breaking up with kind of these, these lower quality / riskier boyfriends and ending up with different boys at end line. Okay. And so
how do you measure the quality of the boys here?
Sorry?
The panel C, how do you measure the quality of boys?
Yeah, so we basically ask the girls to, tell us like, how old is he? Is he in school? So this is all just her reports of this boy.
Okay, so you know that they are new partners or just old partners?
Exactly. So we know they're new. We know they're new from between, because basically at baseline, we ask them who their current partners are. And then at end line, we ask them the same question. And so we can see that they're different at end line. They're differentially different for girls in the goal setting arm at end line.
Okay, so do you have that kind of heterogeneity that the girls at the baseline with more violence, they tend to change their partners?
Exactly. So that was this table here. So this is all of the girls. And then this is just splitting it up by, girls who, if you were, already experiencing IPV at baseline, you can see these are the girls who are a lot less likely to be with the same boyfriend at end line. Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
One thing, all right, I'm running out of time, but one of the things we were worried about though, is that there's like an offset, right? So let me just show in that, I'm showing you that kind of at end line, these goal setting girls are paired with new boys and they look to be like higher quality. And like one of our concerns was that then, we can look at our control girls, right? So these are our control girls in column 1 to see if violence is being offset to the control girls. We don't find any of that, but I will also say that, we didn't interview like every single girl in the community. And so I think this is a fair concern. And I think this is a place, right, where it might be a good thing to also be working with the boys, right? If you're concerned that sort of this violence is being offset to other girls, maybe in these communities, then you're also, working with the boys. And so this is just to, this is just, I showed you this top piece, which was the ITT for, being invited to goal setting. This is just to kind of show you. So for the girls in the goal setting arm, right, as I mentioned, they actually have more total sex partners ever, precisely because they're less likely to be with the same partner they were with at baseline. They're more likely to be with someone new. And in fact, that someone new looks to be somewhat higher quality. Okay. And so this is, we attribute this to kind of the goal setting activity where they kind of engaged in these strategies to think through like, hey, how do I meet these strategies to kind of stay STI negative, to stay healthy, to stay HIV negative, and kind of the result of that in some sense was them pairing with these higher quality boys where we then find these reductions in violence. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, we do estimate this gamma, which is the impact of both being invited to goal setting as well as being in a community where boys are being treated. We don't find any additional complementarities, right? So there's not like additional reductions in violence if you're getting both. And in fact, in our data, it looks like getting either one is enough in terms of reductions in violence, because either intervention is sort of reducing violence enough that there's not that much space for like this additional complementarity to happen. I will say though, in this world where we're basically encouraging women to say no to risky sex, this can have that backlash effect, right? That I showed you kind of that our theory predicts, which is that if it's kind of more of these low type girls who can't exit these relationships, who are now more likely to say no to risky sex, in that world, we would observe increased violence, right, from the boyfriends. And I think in that world, actually treating boys and men could mitigate some of this backlash. Okay. While our findings don't show this backlash, I just want to be careful to say it, in potentially like higher violence settings, for example, you could see some of this happening. Okay. I said we don't have to worry about attrition. The last thing I just want to talk a little about, is we do some cost effectiveness comparisons. Now, one of the problems with cost effectiveness comparisons here is, as I mentioned, there's very little causal evidence on what works to decrease IPV amongst adolescents. But we look at these, so I should say that these kind of first two this is our study, and then we look at two different cash transfer programs. Both of these, though, were cash transfer programs where we saw decreased violence amongst adult women. But I think to me, what's exciting about our work and this intervention is kind of how cheap it was relative to the impacts we're seeing. Now, this is somewhat of an unfair comparison because these cash transfer programs also impact a lot of other outcomes. But, again, I think the sort of cost differences here per 0.25 standard deviation effect size are pretty large. So with that, let me say two more things, and then let me open it up to questions. But I think there's a lot of exciting new research coming out right now suggesting that this early stage of adulthood, this period of adolescence, is a really good time to be thinking about changing some of these gender trajectories that like males and females get stuck in. And I think this is like an area where we need a lot more research to fully understand this, but thinking about kind of, again, understanding like how these interventions work together as well as separately in these types of settings, in higher violence type settings, again, could really provide us with some important guidance on kind of when and where to scale up these types of interventions. So with that, I will thank you all, and shall we open it up to questions?
So if there are pairs, like I'm wondering whether girls or boys with HIV previously, like at a baseline, are not taking any risk during this issue. So they might not be affected by the program, or they care about their partners through your intervention?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I mean, one of the problems, that I say problems in quotes for the study, is just, it was only like around 1% of girls who tested positive for HIV. So it's not many girls. We're very underpowered. I mean, having said that, though, I could still look at them. We haven't done that yet. It might be interesting to see. But the issue is just there were so few girls who, I mean, kind of great news for them, obviously. But we were anticipating much larger numbers of kind of girls who were HIV positive than what we ended up observing in the data.
Yes, Manisha, I was just thinking about the game theoretical framework. I think the game theory gave us a lot of interesting predictions, I think, from the way we modeled the game. And then like how I'm just thinking about the nature of the intervention, how much will it operate through just an informational channel? Basically it's raising the awareness or the knowledge of like the sexual and reproductive health among the adolescent. And are we mainly thinking about this information channel through changing the payoffs in the game, or
yeah,
right,
so I think that's a great question. So yes, I think the information channel is a very salient and important one. I think especially in terms of like thinking about our payoffs from the game. But I think I would be remiss if I didn't also say, like, one of the big, you're asking me as the like research person, but if you were to talk to Grassroots Soccer, for example, or if you were to talk to BRAC, right, who implements ELA, I think for them, like, they sort of, one of their big channels is also through these peer effects, right? And so, for example, just to, like, the reason Grassroots Soccer does their intervention like on the soccer field with like a team of boys is because they feel like it's much easier to change some of these social norms. For example, if you get like a whole group of boys together to do that, right? As opposed to just like doing it individually one-on-one. And so I think there's probably a very important interaction between kind of this knowledge and like social norms, what peers are doing piece of it. We are not like designed to kind of get at what the sort of peer effect piece of it looks like. But I imagine it's probably an important piece of this as well, especially for the boys, I think, right? Because if you're kind of telling boys like, hey, you need to start treating girls better and standing up for them and their rights, like, I think as an adolescent boy, it's probably much easier to do those things if your male friends are also doing them. And that's this whole idea of like trying to shift these underlying social norms, right? That like these organizations, I think ultimately, I think that's the long-term goal, right? Is kind of how do you get these young people to a new equilibrium where then their like marriages look different, how they raise their children looks, right? And anyway, so I think it's probably, it's sort of deeper than just knowledge, but I do think a big piece of this, at least at this age, is also the knowledge piece of it.
Yeah, totally. I feel like from a policy or intervention perspective, right, just like a reduced form evidence of showing that it works is still prevailable for both the policymakers or the organizations, whoever is trying to make changes, right? But just like, because like I think the game theoretical framework is kind of like, to me, it's like a quite novel way of thinking about the thing. So I just like find it very interesting to think about from the theory's perspective. And then another like follow-up is that I think still like if I'm thinking through the game theoretical framework lens, and that might predict some complementarity between the girls and boys treatment, right? And I think you were saying that because like the one intervention alone is like reducing the FPV a lot, right? Already, that's why we're not seeing the complementarity happening, right?
Exactly. So you're exactly right. We're not seeing it in our data, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen in other settings, right? So you're exactly right. The model is very kind of like, hey, especially for, the change in violence due to goal setting, it's ambiguous. We just then develop conditions, right? For like, if it's negative, like we observe, we have to see these exits happening, but you're right in that there absolutely could be complementarities. It's just that we're not observing it in our data, just like there absolutely could be a backlash, right? But we're not observing it in our data.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we'll run out of time. Let me say that thank you very much, Manisha, as well as Janan. And this is very nice research and presentation. And I hope we can have more interactions and have you visit us in the future. And have a good day.
I would love to. I was actually going to tease you all that I want an invitation to China one day too.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, should you pay a visit to PKU? Yeah, if you have traveled to Beijing. Yeah, just feel free to let us know. Yeah, and have a good day. And see you later in another individual meeting.
Great,
Okay.
that sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Webinar will end
you.
now. Yeah, thank you all.